Our story is a story of conquest, not of men and nations, but of technology, and the awesome instruments of military might that help keep men free. It is a story, too, of time and distance, and those who gave us the tools to master them, to move at great speeds, shrinking miles to inches and days into seconds, compacting the vast reaches of our home planet into a small community of neighbors. It was the jet engine that gave us the speed and in-flight refueling that made the long journeys possible. But in the beginning, iron men and wooden ships, a few intrepid aeronauts, and flying machines that challenged the imagination, but little else. The technology that eventually conquered time and distance didn't exist at the turn of the century. Flight itself was the problem, and those who accepted the challenge took halting, uncertain steps, testing untried principles in a new and unfamiliar environment, reaching for an idea whose time had not yet come. Well, flight's first decade was a decade of slow progress at home. Aviation pundits and visionaries were there all right, but government simply was not interested, at least not in a wood and fabric machine of limited speed, even more limited endurance. But attitudes changed August of 1914. World War I will rework the map of Europe and the nature of combat. On the ground, trench warfare and static defense lines yielded only stalemates. But in the air above the lines, history was made. Aircraft assigned to observe and spot for artillery flew unchallenged above the trenches. Military leaders saw the potential. They pressed industry to improve the breed, and soon planes of greater speed, longer range, and sturdier construction were flying. Armed with machine guns and bombs, they assumed new missions: interdiction, bombardment, and air superiority. But problems remained both with planes and tactics, and no one knew better than the men who flew them. Men like John Richter, Lieutenant, Army Air Service. Richter complained that his Spat could stay in the air only 20 to 40 minutes in combat. "I had to fly 9 sorties on the day the San Mahala offensive started," he said, adding almost prophetically, "We all wish we could refuel somehow without having to return to our bases just when the action got interesting." But Richter, along with Lieutenant Lowell Smith, decided to do more than complain, and 6 years later, while stationed at Rockwell Field near San Diego, they set out to prove a hunch: that air-to-air refueling could work, and that in the end, a plane's ability to stay in the air was limited only by the endurance of its crew and the dependability of its engines. The Rockwell Field commander, a major named Hap Arnold, agreed with Richter and Smith. He encouraged them and told them to press on. But even at this early date, 1923, they weren't the first to try. Daredevil aviators had already made the first known crew transfer in flight back in 21, but their methods left much to be desired. With a 5-gallon can of avgas strapped to his back, Wesley May climbed from the wing of a Lincoln Standard up to the wing skid of a JN-4. He worked his way to the Jenny's engine, unstrapped the can, and poured gas into the tank. It should come as no surprise that this pioneering technique did not attract a very wide following. But Smith and Richter had Mr. Ford's better idea. It took 40 feet of hose and steel cable coiled on the cockpit floor, 2 DH-4Bs, a lot of special plumbing, gauges and guts, and Major Arnold's endorsement to get the job done. First actual transfer of gas, June 27, 1923. 2 hookups, 75 gallons, in 6 hours, 39 minutes of continuous flight. The first demonstration of a workable air-to-air refueling system was in the books. But this was the 20s, aviation of carnivals and pilot theatrics, stunning across the country in old Jennies trying to keep bread on the table. The press labeled the Richter-Smith achievement just another in a long series of barnstorming gimmicks. Well, the 2 airmen set out to prove them wrong, and on October 25th, they did just that. Less than 20 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, the 2 Air Service pilots flew their craft non-stop, Canadian border to Tijuana, some 1,200 miles, in 12 hours, 13 minutes, and 40 seconds. A month later, 2 Kelly pilots were killed in a refueling attempt. It was the first time a death occurred, and it put the brakes on further experimentation. It wasn't until 5 years later, New Year's Day 1929, that we got back into the business, this time with a vengeance. The plane, the question mark, the men, Staff Sergeant Roy Ho, Lieutenant Pete Casada, Lieutenant Harry Halverson, Captain Ira Eaker, and the pilot, Major Carl Spatz. The mission, not impossible, but awfully close considering the equipment used. The job of the question mark crew, keep the plane in the air as long as possible, test the practical value of in-flight refueling, endurance of both man and machine. But there was another task, and to many in the Air Service in the 20s and 30s, it was equally as important. The job, according to General Eaker, was to keep military aviation in the headlines. Let Congress and the American people know that air power was no longer a dream, but a strong and vital link in our nation's chain of defense, and that the Air Service was constantly working to make good planes fly even better. It was Pete Casada's idea to try the endurance flight, Ira Eaker who pulled together the people and hardware to make it work, and Tooey Spatz, who marshaled his forces in Washington, getting the support from Major General James Vichay and the Air Staff, moving the program forward and guiding it. Airplane chosen for the job, a Fokker C-2A, a big 3-engine transport monoplane, cruised at about 100 miles an hour. Because of its size, offered the crew some small comfort for the long flight. Amenities, well, 2 wicker chairs, a radio, and a cook stove. The refueling ship, a modified C-1 World Cruiser, a single-engine biplane, 95 miles per hour cruise. Its slightly lower speed will lead to the development of descents or toboggan refueling. Both planes hooked together, descending in a shallow dive, a technique that lets high-performance fighters take on fuel from slower tankers while lessening the danger of a stall. It's all in the record books today, a gift from the crew of the question mark. That crew helped write the refueling book, and it had its share of problems. One of them getting the refueling ship to move on the ground from a standing start when fully loaded. General Casada said later the airplane could fly, it just couldn't taxi. Casada's solution, very simple. 2 crew members dropped their feet to the ground through a hole in the fuselage and started pushing. Once inertia was overcome, they hopped back on board, the rest a piece of cake. Takeoff for the historic flight, 727, January 1st, 1929. The place, Metropolitan Airport, Van Nuys, California. The crew spent the next 6¼ days in the air, shuttling between San Diego and Santa Monica, a distance of about 110 air miles. To keep her in the air, question mark linked to her refueling ship 43 times, a total of 5 hours, 32 minutes. 9 of these contacts were made at night. The 2 ships cruised at 80 miles an hour, some 15 to 20 feet apart, at altitudes ranging from 2,000 to 3,000 feet during the day, 5,000 to 7,000 at night. Major Spatz handled the tricky refueling chores, standing in the 80-mile-per-hour slipstream in goggles, a rubber face mask, gloves, and a raincoat, and looking like some creature from an early science fiction epic, he wrestled the bulky hose to the refueling tanks, often getting drenched for his efforts, when unstable air currents separated the 2 airplanes. The flight attracted newsmen from all over the country, and the curiosity of a couple of young air cadets from San Diego, who asked the usually mild-mannered Harry Halverson if they could take a look. Well, Halverson was not in a particularly good mood. He turned on the 2 youngsters and yelled, "You blasted flying cadets, get out of here." Courtesy LeMay and Frank Griswold turned around and did as they were told. By this time, fatigue beginning to set in, the plane neither airtight or very quiet, and after 4 or 5 days, everyone getting a bit groggy. Of more immediate concern, a gradual power loss in one of the engines. Now, the crew stayed up as long as it could, but landed while they still had enough power to pick their own spot. That point reached on the 7th day, 150 hours, 40 minutes, 15 seconds into the flight. Question mark down near Burbank at what's now the Lockheed Aircraft Plant. Final statistics impressive even by today's standards. Transferred from the mothership to the question mark, 5,660 gallons of gasoline, 245 gallons of oil, 17 meals, water, batteries, and other supplies. All told, some 40 tons during almost 1 week of continuous flying. The flight over, but not the story of air-to-air refueling. Our Army Air Service entered the picture again in 1942, when flight refueling was asked to install its equipment on a B-24 tanker and a B-17 receiver. Successful tests were actually conducted at Eglin that year, but the project never moved beyond the test phase. Our bombers were able to meet their mission range requirements without aerial refueling. It wasn't until the development of the A-bomb, the end of the hot war, and the start of the cold that we moved ahead once again. SAC determined it was absolutely essential that we be able to hit any target, anywhere, from any base, at any time, and air-to-air refueling the only answer. And once again, flight refueling called in, this time 1948, to convert 100 B-29s as receivers, another 60 as tankers. At the same time, Wright Field given the go-ahead to develop an improved system. By 1950, higher aircraft speeds and the requirement to serve as single-seat fighters pointed to the need for newer, faster, more efficient systems, both flight refueling and Boeing given the task. Flight refueling's job, develop a special system for fighters, and probe and drogue the solution. A simple hose with a basket or drogue at one end. When a thirsty fighter approached, the hose was reeled out, the fighter flying its probe directly into the basket for a hookup. Now the drogue couldn't offload quickly, but probe and drogue would permit simultaneous refuelings, 3 at one time, and greater flexibility in rough air. Boeing's answer developed in just 4 short months, the flying boom. It was faster, easier to use, a boomer flying the probe directly to the receiver. Large amounts of fuel, up to 900 gallons a minute, could be transferred in a short time. Boeing had worked hard to develop an efficient system of aerial refueling. Their rigid boom had small wing surfaces, so it could be controlled precisely in the air. The system worked well when the tanker and receiving airplane were both piston engine powered. Their speed and altitude capability were similar, and they could easily fly in close formation. The standard Air Force tanker at this time was the Boeing KC-97, the military version of the Stratocruiser. The Stratocruiser went into production in 1947. 55 were built, but they were not the way of the future. At the time, the U.S. Air Force was running a competition for a jet bomber. Boeing then asked the Air Force to defer their entry into the competition because they were interested in examining the swept wing, which had just been uncovered. But jet engines were a different proposition. Boeing's entry into the competition was the XB-47. Unlike its competitors, it wasn't a conversion or adaptation of old piston engine designs. It had flexible swept wings and 6 jet engines. It was a real breakthrough. The B-47 entered production in 1948 and was eventually built in large numbers. The range of early jet engines was limited. Jet bombers needed to fly long distances, therefore, air refueling was necessary. Problems arose when refueling jet engine receivers. Instead of continuing to fly high and fast to refuel, the jet was forced to fly low and slow. Boeing in 1950, while developing the B-52, decided that they were through with propellers forever, and that the big airplanes belonged to the jet. Boeing was convinced of the need for a jet tanker. The government representatives at Wright Field didn't agree with Boeing. They wanted a tanker to be a transport, and to them, that meant propellers. There was a feeling among those at Boeing who were enthusiastic that the only way they had to demonstrate this point was to build an airplane. The airplane would cost Boeing $16 million to build. At the time the Boeing board approved the demonstrator project, it was to be called the 707. But Bill Allen, the chairman of the board, stepped in and changed the model designation to 367-80. 367 was the model number of the KC-97 piston engine tankers, and there is a theory that he was trying to mislead Boeing's competitors. The number 80 represented the 80th version developed under the 367 model number. The demonstrator became known as the Dash 80. In 1953, while the Dash 80 was being built, the Air Force had finally announced a jet tanker design competition. The growing fleet of B-52 long-range bombers still relied on the old Boeing KC-97 tankers for aerial refueling. It was a difficult and inefficient system. A B-52 being refueled by a KC-97 had to fly just above stalling speed. The Dash 80 was officially rolled out of Boeing's Renton plant on May 15, 1954. To a 1950s crowd used to DC-3s, DC-6s, and Boeing Stratocruisers, it was a revolutionary sight. On July 14, 1954, Boeing engineers declared the Dash 80 ready for flight. For the Dash 80 to demonstrate superior capability as a fuel tanker, a retractable refueling boom had to be fitted. This boom was tested on the ground at Boeing's boom testing tower before it was installed in the Dash 80. Before the refueling boom was fitted, the Dash 80 flew in close formation with the B-52 to check stability and control characteristics in the refueling position. When these tests were successful, a section of the Dash 80's rear fuselage was removed and replaced with the pod that would house the refueling boom. The installation of this pod was highly critical. Dash 80 would be flying at high speed and high altitude, only feet away from the receiving airplane. It was crucial that the airflow over the modified rear end of the fuselage did not change the airplane's handling characteristics. The pod not only contained the boom, it also housed the boom controller, later to be known as the boom operator, who lay flat out facing the tail. The controller could raise one section of the pod, opening a window from which he could see the whole refueling operation. With his left hand, the operator controlled the extension and retraction of the boom. With his right, he handled the control surfaces of the boom itself. These were called rotavators and allowed the operator to actually fly the boom to the refueling point on the receiving aircraft. There was no fuel transfer system aboard the Dash 80, and no additional fuel was carried, so the series of tests flown in this format was called the dry boom test. At first, the aerodynamic effects of the boom pod itself were analyzed. Then a chase plane made close observations of the behavior of the extended boom in flight. At an altitude of 26,000 feet and speeds up to Mach 8, or 8/10 the speed of sound, the boom was tested right through its control range, before flight contact with a B-52 receiving airplane was made. The dry boom test proved conclusively that a jet tanker could refuel jet bombers at speeds and altitudes far beyond the capability of piston engine airplanes. But that in itself was not enough. The Air Force was dead set against a Boeing tanker because they wanted to invent whatever tanker they bought, and here Boeing had a prototype flying, and the Air Force didn't design it, didn't pay for it, and they didn't own it. This became somewhat of an embarrassment. The contract for the tanker was to be decided on the basis of a competition. John Steiner, then vice president for Boeing, ran their end of the competition. However, Lockheed won out. The Air Force set out to buy Lockheed tankers. The Strategic Air Command, under General Curtis E. LeMay, wanted a jet tanker for the B-52 and B-47s. Also, Boeing already had an airplane flying, and they could offer delivery dates that no one could offer. And they could offer prices that were fixed and believable. The Strategic Air Command requirements prevailed, and the Air Force bought 17 KC-135s with the strict instructions to everyone involved not a dime should be spent on thinking about airplanes beyond number 17. Those were all going to be Lockheed airplanes. However, due to the success Boeing had with the KC-135, the restrictions placed on the initial order of 17 didn't seem to matter, and over 800 135s were built. The first KC-135 of the initial order of 17 emerged from Boeing's factory in July 1956. It proved to be the right airplane at the right time. In spite of the Air Force's initial reluctance, the KC-135 became a great success. The Cold War was intense. American long-range bombers were constantly in the air, and KC-135 boomers were helping to keep them there. The boom operator takes up his position in the pod at the rear of the airplane. The bomber to be refueled is a B-52.
Redhead 2-2, your range is 5 miles.
Roger, 5 miles. Planet, this is boom operator. I have him in sight. Okay, Boomer, you're cleared for command.
The operator lowers the boom and guides the B-52 in.
Blueprint 5-0, this is Redhead 2-2 Boomer. How do you read?
Redhead Boomer, read you 5 by 5.
Roger, receiver. Tanker ready for contact. Forward 40. Forward 15. Forward 5.
The rotavators on the boom allow the boom operator to fly it precisely into position.
Forward 2. Stand by for contact.
rate of 1,000 gallons a minute. The B-52 is refueled in the air without having to lose altitude or fly at dangerously low speeds. The jet tanker that Boeing and the Dash 80 worked so hard to promote is a reality.
Blueprint, that completes the refueling. Disconnect on my count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Disconnect. Have a good trip.
More than 800 KC-135s were built, and many are still in use. It was to Southeast Asia the KC-135 took the boom operation. supporting various aircraft throughout the Air Force inventory. Their skills and professionalism enable them to perform under any circumstances, adapting to the aircraft's attitude, the conditions of the air refueling track, and the stability of the receiver. Responsible for safely conducting the air refueling operations, they ensure that multi-million-dollar aircraft are not damaged, but refueled with the ease of pulling into a neighborhood gas station. These men and women serving in the active duty, guard, and the reserves have supported countless numbers of missions, both in the continental United States and throughout the world. They have supported numerous exercises, both joint service and with other nations. Their profession would find them in such faraway places as Keflavik, Iceland, sitting on alert, waiting for the call to support fighters who would defend an area defense zone against a potential adversary. This adversary would test the response time and capability of our crews to intercept their aircraft. Information gained by these intercepts would prove to be valuable in tracking equipment carried and modifications made to these airplanes. The efforts of these crews and the support given them by aero refueling enabled our nation to remain vigilant against such threats and to send strong messages to any nation who doubted our passion for freedom and our capability and dedication to preserving it. Air refueling operations have had a huge impact on air operations, and the accomplishments of the KC-135 and its crews have been unparalleled in history. For 25 years, the KC-135 stood alone in its role as a tanker, meeting the needs of the Air Force and its ever-changing mission. In 1981, the McDonnell Douglas KC-10A joined the Air Force inventory. The KC-10, with its increased payload, is capable of moving entire units, people, equipment, and aircraft to any place in the world. This newer, more advanced tanker will join with the 135 force and bring to the boom operator career field another avenue with which to pursue our passions. Armed with the different controls and somewhat different equipment, the boom operator was able to sit in comfort, handling the controls of a newer, more advanced boom with precision and accuracy. The receiving aircraft was guided into position. These boom operators would later affectionately be referred to by 135 boom operators as the Gucci Boys. These booms had all received their start in the KC-135, and the skills learned in the old steam jet would serve them well in the 10. Together with the 135, the 10 would play a vital role in the Air Force's capability, both as a refueler and equally as an airlifter. 1986 saw the 135 re-engine, introducing the KC-135R with its turbofan engines and 88,000 pounds of thrust. It meant longer range and better fuel capability for the 135. The boom operators on the various models of the KC-135, together with those on the KC-10, would serve in the Air Force, supporting all types of aircraft. Drogue systems on the KC-135s and KC-10s allowed the boom operators to experience that unique feeling of helplessness that only the Navy can offer. As they test the limits of the drogue, dragging it throughout the envelope in what appears to be attempts to wrap it around their probe. Because of the air refueling team of the KC-135s and KC-10s, when problems arose in the Middle East that threatened our nation's interest, we were able to respond. With the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein, it was imperative that action be taken. Once again, air refueling played a vital role in the deployment of forces. Desert Storm plans called for an air war to take out the enemy's eyes and ears. Coalition aircraft would immediately attack Iraq's air defense systems, command and communication capabilities, and the Iraqi Air Force. Then bomb supply routes into southern Iraq and Kuwait. The last phase of the air campaign would be the bombing of frontline Iraqi troops, armor, and artillery. On January 17th at 0200, the first stealth fighter slipped off its tanker and went undetected into Iraq. Boom operators had found themselves playing a vital part in bringing aircraft, men, women, and equipment across an air bridge that enabled a tyrant to be crushed beneath the talons of an eagle. Desert Storm had begun. The days to follow would prove the value of America's planning and training. During the air war, Coalition Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps pilots, flying thousands of sorties originating from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other countries, shocked Baghdad's command and control capability, air defense, and Air Force as planned. They went on to knock out virtually all the supply routes to the Iraqi Army in the south as well. In the final phase of the air war, coalition aircraft continually pounded frontline Iraqi forces. Tomahawk cruise missiles and laser-guided smart bombs zeroed in on targets with deadly accuracy, leaving surrounding areas untouched. Tanker support in Desert Shield was no less significant than it was during Desert Storm itself. Tanker crews flew 4,967 sorties, totaling nearly 20,000 flight hours. Boom operators refueled 14,588 aircraft, including 5,495 Navy and Marine aircraft, offloading some 68.2 million gallons of fuel. Desert Storm's record, 15,434 sorties, nearly 60,000 flying hours. Boom operators refueling 45,995 aircraft, offloading 110.2 million gallons of fuel. There is satisfaction in this work. There always will be. As long as a roaring jet seeks to stretch the limits of time and distance, and a pulse-quickened cry for help crackles over the radio, this calling, this special bond that unites those who fly will remain. Even though technology gives us new wings to try, tomorrow's wide-body tankers, the B-2, and an Eagle whose talons reach to the edges of space, this bond is sure and true. It is future secure. Those who dared and conquered made it so. Those nameless pilots, navigators, boomers, and flight mechanics. The Richters and Smiths, the Halbertsons, the Casadas, Eakers and Hoes, and a man named Carl Spatz. They did it. Theirs is the conquest, and theirs the glory.